Welcome to the Reel Debrief, the show where we dive deep into the world of film production, exploring the genres you love, the projects making waves, and the trends shaping the industry. We're here to give you a 360-degree review for entertainment professionals. So grab your popcorn and get ready for some expert insights. And, well, the occasional bed joke from Talen. It's the Reel Debrief. Now your hosts, Talen and Lisa.
Hey everyone. Welcome back to the show. It's your host, Talen, here to bring you another deep dive into pop culture history. Well, I mean, the bits of it that are wild, crazy, or totally underappreciated. And as always, I've got my witty co-host, Lisa, right by my side. Say hey, Lisa.
Hey, Talen. Hey, listeners. I'm super excited about today's episode because we are digging into something that not a lot of people talk about anymore, but it was huge in its moment. Daytime revolution. This isn't just any old TV history, folks. This is a one-week cultural explosion on daytime television in 1972. It was John Lennon, Yoko Ono, and a TV host who had no idea what he was in for.
That's right. For 1 week in February 1972, John Lennon and Yoko Ono, yes, the John and Yoko, took over the Mike Douglas show. And for anyone out there who's like, wait, the Mike Douglas show? Yes, folks. This was your typical daytime TV show. Light entertainment, celebrities, musicians, and a little chat, a little fun. But then John and Yoko came in and everything changed. They turned it into a platform for some radical ideas. And the result? The most unexpected week of television ever.
It's wild to think about it. Imagine if today, Beyonce and Jay-Z took over The Ellen Show and spent an entire week talking about anti-war movements, civil rights, and inviting activists on stage. Can you picture how Twitter would explode? The equivalent happened back then, minus Twitter, of course. People were freaking out.
Totally. And the thing is, they used this super mainstream platform, daytime TV, where stay-at-home moms and retirees tuned in for their own kind of Trojan horse. I mean, they mixed entertainment and activism in a way that had never been done before. And today, we're going to break it all down. The context, the cultural impact, and why we're still talking about this 50 years later.
That's right. We'll take you through who these guests were, what they talked about, and what it all meant in the context of the 1970s. And of course, we'll throw in our own takes, as we do, to make sure you're thoroughly entertained while you learn something new.
You know, Lisa, it's kind of crazy when you think about how much people underestimated Lennon and Ono. Like, yeah, Lennon was famous for his music, but by 1972, he was also famous for being an activist. And Yoko Ono was this avant-garde artist who nobody really got, and yet here they were on this show, bridging the gap between the counterculture and what people thought of as regular life.
Absolutely. And the host, Mike Douglas, bless him, was not exactly someone you'd think of as a revolutionary. I mean, he wasn't out there with a protest sign. He was more of a friendly, all-American TV host, you know? But here's the thing about Douglas. He was curious. He had this intellectual curiosity that made him willing to let these two come onto his show and shake things up.
Yeah, that's one of the things that really stood out to me. Douglas wasn't trying to fight them. He wasn't out there saying, oh no, let's keep this light and fluffy. He actually engaged with them. And that's part of what made the show work. Lennon and Ono had this platform, and Douglas allowed them to use it, even when it got uncomfortable. And let's be real, Lisa, it did get uncomfortable at times.
Oh, it definitely did. I mean, you had guests like Jerry Rubin, co-founder of the Yippies and a known provocateur, coming on the show. Rubin's whole thing was basically to poke the establishment in the eye, and here he is, sitting on this daytime TV show, talking about revolution. And Douglas is sitting there like, okay, tell me more. Can you imagine how tense that must have been behind the scenes?
Right? I mean, I imagine the producers were just like, please nobody call for an actual revolution while we're live on air. And honestly, Rubin was pretty restrained. But still, the fact that they were willing to put him on and let him speak to a national audience says a lot about how gutsy that week really was.
And let's not forget, they were doing all of this while being very aware that the Nixon administration had their eyes on them. John Lennon was already on Nixon's naughty list by this point. The FBI had him under surveillance, and the government was actively trying to deport him.
Right! And here they are on national television with Yoko Ono bringing out her box of smiles. Literally a little box that was supposed to be full of good vibes. And everyone's like, what's happening right now? I mean, but they kept it light too. It wasn't all heavy-handed. In fact, that's what made the whole thing so brilliant.
That's what's fascinating to me. They could have come out and just lectured people, but instead, they mixed in music, art, and playful moments. Like, you've got Chuck Berry performing, you've got Broadway stars like Vivian Reed showing up. It wasn't just about activism, it was about creating this total experience that kept people entertained and made them think. I think a lot of shows could learn from that today, don't you think?
Oh, totally. It's like they knew they had to keep people watching, so they used entertainment as this way to Trojan horse these big ideas. People were probably tuning in thinking, oh cool, John Lennon's on. But then they stayed because they got sucked into these conversations about civil rights and anti-war protests.
Exactly, and speaking of civil rights, let's talk about Bobby Seale's appearance. This guy was the co-founder of the Black Panther Party. And the Black Panthers were a serious force in the 60s and 70s. They were known for advocating for black self-defense, for pushing against police brutality, and for running community programs. And here he is on the Mike Douglas show, sitting next to John Lennon, casually discussing revolution.
Right. And Seale, like Rubin, wasn't coming in hot like you might expect. He was calm, collect, and just explaining what the Black Panthers were about. I think a lot of people who tuned in had probably heard all sorts of terrifying things about the Panthers from the media. But here, Seale presenting himself in a way that was rational, eloquent, and very, very real.
Yeah, and I think that's where Lennon and Ono really made an impact. By bringing on people like Seale, they were challenging the narrative. They were saying, these aren't radicals to be feared. They're people with ideas that deserve to be heard. That's a pretty powerful statement to make on daytime TV in 1972.
Yeah, it really is. And I think that's part of what makes this week so memorable. You've got these guests who were seen as dangerous or subversive, but when you actually listen to what they're saying, it's like, wait, these are just ideas. These are people talking about equality and fairness and peace.
Yeah, it's amazing how radical those ideas seemed at the time, isn't it? I mean, looking back now, we're like, oh, of course people should have equal rights, or of course we should be against war. But back then, those were fighting words. And Lennon and Ono were using this massive platform to make those conversations happen.
And I think that's why we're still talking about it 50 years later. This wasn't just a public stunt for Lennon and Ono. It was a genuine attempt to bridge that gap between the counterculture and mainstream America, and in some ways, they succeeded. In others, maybe not so much, but either way, they changed the game.
Definitely. And speaking of changing the game, let's talk about the music for a second. Because not only were they talking about heavy issues, but they were also bringing some incredible musicians onto the show. Chuck Berry, Vivian Reed. I mean, that's a whole other layer of genius, right?
Oh, for sure. Chuck Berry, the guy who practically invented rock and roll on daytime TV, jamming out with John Lennon? Are you kidding me? That alone was worth tuning in for. And that's what made the show so brilliant. They blended these radical ideas with music and art that everyone could enjoy.
It's like they were saying, hey, we're not just going to preach at you. We're going to give you something to enjoy while we challenge your thinking. And it worked. Even people who didn't agree with their politics stayed tuned in because they wanted to see the performances.
Exactly. The ultimate mix of entertainment and enlightenment. I mean, Chuck Berry alone was a musical genius. If you weren't staying for the politics, you were definitely staying for that legendary jam session with Lennon. And can we talk about how smooth that transition was? They went from discussing civil rights one minute to riffing on guitars the next. It's like Lennon and Ono knew they had to keep everyone engaged, and what better way to do that than with some good old-fashioned rock and roll?
Oh, absolutely. I think the performances, especially by someone like Chuck Berry, gave the audience a moment to breathe between all these heavy discussions. It's like, here's a mind-blowing conversation about civil rights, and now we're going to hit you with some rock and roll to process that. It was smart because it kept the pace moving. It was never just too much of one thing. It was this perfect blend.
And speaking of blends, let's not forget about Vivian Reed, the Broadway star who brought this incredible energy to the stage. People sometimes overlook that, but she was a major part of the entertainment lineup that week. Her performance brought Broadway to daytime TV, and that was something people didn't get every day back then.
Totally. Reed's performance added a kind of vibrancy to the show that, in a way, symbolized the spirit of the entire week. It wasn't just one genre of entertainment, one type of guest, or one way of thinking. It was this beautiful collage of ideas, art, music, and activism. And that's where I think Lennon and Ono really hit their stride. They weren't pigeonholing anyone. Everyone had a voice at the table.
And that's where the Mike Douglas show became so much more than just a talk show for that week. It becomes this experiment in blending entertainment and politics in a way that daytime TV had never seen before. I mean, and probably hasn't seen since. The fact that it worked, even briefly, is kind of a miracle when you think about it.
Definitely, and it's funny because when we look back now, with hindsight, the whole thing feels almost tame. Like, compared to the chaos we see on modern TV and the internet, that week on the Mike Douglas show feels pretty controlled, despite the radical ideas being presented. But at the time, it must have felt revolutionary, especially with the Nixon administration breathing down their necks.
Yeah, tame by today's standards for sure. But back then, this was the Nixon era, and the counterculture was something the government was actively trying to suppress. The fact that John Lennon and Yoko Ono were up there, live on daytime TV, talking about peace and revolution, it was a big deal. And they did it in such a charming, almost laid-back way that you almost forgot how bold it really was.
And that's what made it work. The laid-back vibe lulled people in. It was like, here, have a smile, enjoy some music, and oh, by the way, let's talk about overthrowing the establishment. Lennon and Ono understood how to play with expectations. And so did Mike Douglas, honestly. He was this unassuming guy, but he knew what was happening on his show, and he went with it.
Yeah, exactly. And I love that about Douglas. He wasn't resisting or pushing back. He was genuinely curious, asking questions, and allowing these guests to share their thoughts. I mean, he was a bridge, really. And that's something I don't think he gets enough credit for. He let Lennon and Ono run wild, but he also grounded the show when it needed to be.
Yeah, it could have easily gone off the rails, but Douglas kept it all together with his quiet grace. I mean, there were moments when you could see the tension, like when Jerry Rubin came on, but Douglas never lost his cool. He kept the conversation flowing. And that's part of why the show worked so well that week.
Yeah, it's true. And even when things got a little weird, because let's be real, this was John Lennon and Yoko Ono we're talking about, Douglas just rolled with it. Yoko's box of smiles, I mean, that's pretty out there. But Douglas wasn't like, what is this nonsense? He went with it. That's what made him the perfect host for this wild experiment.
Exactly. And it's funny because I think people underestimated Yoko Ono at the time. She got a lot of flack, but she was bringing something totally unique to the table. Sure, some of it was out there, but she wasn't just the wife of John Lennon. She was an artist in her own right, and she had ideas that were challenging people. And I think that's why it worked. You had these two forces, John and Yoko, pushing boundaries, but doing it in this gentle, almost playful way.
And Yoko had a sense of humor about it too. That's something people miss. She was serious about her art and her activism, but she wasn't above a little playful weirdness. And I think the audience was sort of harmed by it, even if they didn't fully understand what she was doing. It was like, okay, I don't get this box of smiles thing, but I'm intrigued.
And intrigue is what made people keep watching. You didn't know what was coming next, but you wanted to find out. One minute you're listening to Bobby Seale talk about the Black Panther Party, and the next you're jamming with Chuck Berry. It was unpredictable in the best possible way.
Exactly. And that unpredictability is what made the show legendary. It wasn't just about the politics or the music. It was about blending all these different elements together in a way that kept people engaged. I mean, the fact that we're still talking about it today, it speaks volumes.
Oh, for sure. And speaking of blending elements, let's not forget the humor. As much as they were talking about serious issues, there were these light moments that kept everything from feeling too heavy. John Lennon, for all his activism, had this mischievous side, and he wasn't afraid to poke fun at things, even at himself.
Yeah, totally. There's this great moment where Lennon's chewing gum, and he looks like he's totally chilled out while all these big ideas are flying around him. It's like he knew how to take the edge off. He wasn't taking himself too seriously, even when he was talking about really serious stuff. I mean, that's what made him relatable.
Right. It was like, yeah, we're talking about revolution, but let's not forget to have a little fun while we're at it. And that's the kind of energy that made people love Lennon. He was this huge star with these big ideas, but he never lost that everyman charm. And I think that's why people stayed tuned in. Even if they didn't agree with everything he said, they were drawn to him because he didn't feel like he was above them.
Yeah, exactly. He had that charm, and Yoko had that quirkiness, and together they created something totally unique. And you know what? It worked. Even if the ideas were radical for daytime TV, they made it approachable. People stayed engaged because they liked Lennon and Ono, even if they didn't fully buy into the counterculture.
And that's what I think modern TV and media could learn from today. You can tackle tough subjects, but you've got to make it engaging. You've got to blend entertainment with substance. Lennon and Ono weren't just up there yelling about politics. They were playing music, having fun, and talking to people like human beings. That's why it resonated.
Exactly. And as much as we've evolved with media, some things never change. People don't want to feel like they're being preached at. They want to be entertained, but also challenged. And Daytime Revolution did that brilliantly. It was entertainment with a purpose.
Totally. And speaking of entertainment with a purpose, we can't end this without talking about how ahead of its time this whole thing was. In today's world of social media and platforms like YouTube, people can mix entertainment with activism all the time. But in 1972, that was groundbreaking.
Oh, absolutely. Lennon and Ono were pioneers in using entertainment as activism. And they did it on a massive mainstream platform. Sure, we see that now with celebrities speaking out on social media, but back then, going on a daytime talk show and talking about civil rights and anti-war movements was revolutionary. They were using their platform in a way that most celebrities, they just weren't doing it.
Right, and even today, you don't see that level of engagement on mainstream platforms like you did during that week. Sure, celebrities might tweet or post an Instagram story, but a week-long takeover of a talk show? That's rare. And I think that's why this week of television still stands out all these years later.
It really does. And for anyone out there who's hearing about this for the first time, trust me, you've got to check it out. Daytime Revolution is more than just a cool story. It's a reminder of what happens when entertainment and activism come together in a meaningful way.
Exactly. And on that note, I think it's safe to say that Daytime Revolution is not just a moment in TV history. It's a blueprint for how we can use media to make a real impact. It's about showing that pop culture and activism don't have to be separate. they can live in the same space and create something unforgettable.
Oh, amen to that, Lisa. It's like John and Yoko had this magic touch where they could throw all these different elements into the mix: art, music, activism. And instead of creating a mess, they created something beautiful and lasting. They weren't just giving people entertainment, they were giving them something to think about long after the show ended. And honestly, isn't that what great TV should do?
Exactly. And I think that's what we're missing sometimes in today's media landscape. We're so focused on quick hits and viral moments. But what Lennon, Ono, and Mike Douglas did was create a whole week of thoughtful television that made a real impact. I mean, this wasn't just a flash in the pan. It was a carefully crafted moment that still resonates today.
And speaking of things that resonate, Lisa, I've got to ask, what's your biggest takeaway from that week of television? I mean, what was the one thing that still sticks with you?
Ooh, tough question, Talen. But if I had to pick one thing, it's the idea that you don't have to sacrifice entertainment to talk about big, important issues. Lennon and Ono managed to entertain and educate at the same time. It wasn't either or, it was both. And that's something I think we can all learn from, especially in a time when we're bombarded with so much content that lacks depth.
Oh yeah, totally agree. And my biggest takeaway personally, it's gotta be how brave they were. Lennon and Ono were pushing boundaries, but they weren't doing it for shock value. They were doing it because they believed in something. They used the most mainstream platform available to them, and instead of playing it safe, they went all in. They talked about revolution, peace, civil rights, and they did it with a smile. Come on, that takes guts.
Yes, guts and a whole lot of charisma. They weren't afraid to get people a little uncomfortable, but they did it in a way that invited conversation, not confrontation. That's a rare skill, especially in today's climate.
Exactly. And that's why this week of television still matters today. It wasn't just about the moment. It was about showing what could happen when you put real ideas in front of people who wouldn't normally encounter them. They did it with style, humor, and a whole lot of charm.
So if you haven't seen Daytime Revolution, or if this is the first time you're hearing about it, I highly recommend looking it up. It's a fascinating piece of history, and it's just as relevant today as it was back in 1972.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think we've covered just about everything on this incredible moment in TV history. I've had a blast diving into this with you, Lisa. And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most unexpected weeks in daytime TV. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have.
Thanks so much, everyone. And if you've got thoughts, questions, or you just want to geek out about John Lennon and Yoko Ono, hit us up. We love hearing from you.
That's right. And don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and tell your friends about the show. Come on. We've got more incredible episodes coming your way, and trust me, you don't want to miss them.
Until next time, folks, keep smiling, keep learning, and maybe even keep a box of smiles on hand like Yoko would.
Love that, God. All right, folks, take care, and we'll catch you on the next one.
This has been the Reel Debrief. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, like, rate, and review. We'll see you soon on the Reel Debrief.